run. He first came to public notice when he completely circled the Union Army during McClellan's Peninsula campaign. Now, McClellan being what he was, that might not be as great a feat, since McClellan wasn't much for moving much as a general. But still, he went on a 3-day ride, completely circled the Union troops, traveled 150 miles, captured a lot of soldiers and supplies, and he performed a similar feat during Lee's Maryland campaign. There is some controversy about this, which we'll get to in a moment. He also distinguished himself at Fredericksburg, and he was part of the famous flanking movement in Chancellorsville, executed by Stonewall Jackson. And he actually temporarily took command of Jackson's corps after Jackson was accidentally shot by his own men. We're going to talk more about Chancellorsville when we get to Lee. There is a black mark on his reputation, and that's why I have this number 5 and not higher. Some of you may be familiar with his lack of reconnaissance from Lee leading up to the Battle of Gettysburg. As the Battle of Gettysburg is getting closer to occurring, Lee has no idea where the Union Army is. The Union Army has no idea where the Confederate Army is. Lee is depending on Stuart as a cavalry officer to go out and do the reconnaissance. Instead, Stuart was out burning supplies and capturing horses. Good stuff. But when he showed up at the camp and said, General Lee, I've captured all these supplies for you, and General Lee said, they're worthless to me. Where were you when I needed you? To tell me where the Union Army was. 1864, Stuart was killed at the Battle of Yellow Tavern, just north of Richmond. I think his exploits, particularly in the early part of the war, helped boost morale in the South. And that's a reason to have one here. I don't think he was the best Confederate cavalry commander of the war. We'll get to someone else who I think was that in a second. But he was a very fine cavalry officer. He had a little bit of flair. We now get to the person I think was the best Confederate side during the war, is a man named Nathan Bedford Forrest. He was as controversial on the Confederate side as Sherman is on the Union side. He's also probably the greatest cavalry officer in the history of the United States. I got a lot of respect for the guy. He's a wealthy plantation owner in Tennessee, and he enlists as a private in the Confederate Army in 1861. Usually, if you had money and you wanted to fight the Confederate Army, they'd make you at least a lieutenant colonel for walking in the door. He enlisted as a private in the Confederate Army. He used his own money to outfit his regiment with horses and supplies, and when his superiors figured out he had money, he quickly was made a lieutenant colonel, being one of the quickest rises through the ranks in the history of the military, going from private to lieutenant colonel in a matter of days. In February 1862, at the Battle of Fort Donelson, Forrest led almost 4,000 troops across the Cumberland to safety, escaping siege by Grant. Now remember, how many soldiers did Gideon Pillow save when he fled Donelson? That would be 1 himself. How many did Forrest save? 4,000. I rest my case on Pillow. Moving on. July 13, 1862, he defeats Union General Thomas Crittenden in Murfreesboro. Shortly after, he leads 2,000 men in a series of raids that disrupted Grant's communication lines at Vicksburg. April 1863, in northern Alabama and western Georgia, he is sent to counter an attack by Union cavalry under Colonel Abel Strait. After pursuing Strait for over 2 weeks, Forrest defeats him at Cedar Bluff, Alabama. At the Battle of Chickamauga, Forrest, all by himself, pursues the retreating Union forces, even though Bragg did send the rest of the army after him. And we already talked about the fact that he threatened to kill Bragg after the battle, asking why did Bragg even bother to fight. April 12, 1864, the first controversy. Forrest attacks Fort Pillow near the Mississippi River in western Tennessee. A large number of black soldiers, Union soldiers, were killed in this attack. Some people accused Forrest of either ordering a massacre or turning a blind eye to the massacre, because supposedly the black troops were trying to surrender. June 10, 1864, Forrest has his greatest battle, the Battle of Rice's Crossroads. He's outnumbered 3-1, and he wins a resounding victory, suffering 492 casualties and over 2,000 for the Union. And later, Forrest served under John Bell Hood in the Franklin-Nashville campaign. Who knows what kind of verbal exchanges occurred between the two of them. And he surrendered in May 1865. Now, if you were a Forrest detractor, you will point out that Forrest helped start the Ku Klux Klan and was probably the first Grand Kleagle, or whatever they call it back then. However, if you were a Forrest supporter, you will point out that a year later he quit the Klan because he thought it was becoming too violent. He's most famous for saying that the whole essence of battle was to get their firstest with the mostest. He probably never said it quite that way. He was an educated man, but it does describe his theories about mobile warfare. Number 3, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, one of Lee's greatest generals, earned his famous nickname at the first battle of Bull Run. The Confederate forces were losing at one point in the battle, and Brigadier General Bernard Beatty pointed to Jackson and his men and said, "Look, there stands Jackson like a stone wall. Rally around the Virginians." The Confederates did, and they won the first battle of Bull Run. And of course, the wonderful name stuck. Isn't that a great name? I mean, if you were a general, your nickname is Stonewall. Great success at Second Bull Run. Harper's Ferry, where it captured 29,000 Union forces. It's the biggest amount of Union forces that surrendered in a single battle in the war. Antietam, Fredericksburg, the Valley campaign. Chancellorsville, when Lee split his army into two, he was Stonewall Jackson. He gave the job of going on a 12-mile flanking movement, and he was able to attack Joseph Hooker from the side, from a flanking attack, and won the battle. And yes, in case you've always wondered, Joe, the prostitutes are nicknamed hookers because of the nature of the camp followers that follow Hooker's Civil War camp. May 2nd, 1863, Jackson was mortally wounded at Chancellorsville by his own troops. He'd been out doing his own reconnaissance. Another thing I respect the man for is, here's a lieutenant general, a corps commander in Lee's army. He's out doing his own reconnaissance. He didn't have his own password. He was challenged by his own troops, and he didn't have the password, and they shot him. After learning that Jackson had been wounded and had lost his arm, Lee is reported to have said, "He has lost his left arm, but I've lost my right." He died 8 days later of pneumonia, and his last words are reported to have been, "Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees." Lee had lost his greatest tactician, and the South would suffer for the rest of the war. And I always ask, what if Jackson had still been alive at Gettysburg? Would Pinkett's charge ever have happened? Jackson was the one guy who could argue with Lee and win. Jackson would have said, "No, we're not going to do this. It's stupid. Sorry. Sorry, Bobby, but it's stupid." But he was gone. What about in charge of Confederate forces during the Atlantic campaign? Would it have been so easy for Sherman if Jackson had been in charge of the troops? Now, some people will say, why didn't you put him higher? Some people would put him number 2 or number 1. Simply pragmatic. He wasn't around the last 2 years of the war. It wasn't his fault, but he wasn't. The guy I put number 2, which will probably be controversial to some people, is James Longstreet. He's actually Lee's senior corps commander. Lee made him a corps commander 2 days before he made Jackson a corps commander. So for the rest of the war, Longstreet always referred to himself as the senior corps commander under Robert Lee. He was an expert at defensive tactics. He rejected the old Napoleonic tactic of offensive attacks across open fields. And guess what? He was right. By the time of the Civil War, it was pretty stupid to have 20,000 guys run across an open field against an entrenched position. Lee referred to Longstreet as his old warhorse. My view is, along with George Thomas on the Union side, he's probably the most impressive corps commander of the war. At Bull Run, Second Bull Run, it was Longstreet's assault on Pope's left to turn the tide of the battle. At Fredericksburg, it was Longstreet's idea to dig in behind that stone wall and build defensive fortifications. Union assault produced 8,000 Union casualties to 1,000 for the Confederates. But the reason I have him